Hello and welcome to today's little offshoot of a video. Normally we do some deck tech and gameplay videos on the channel, but I wanted to change something up, as I often try to do every once in a while. I was thinking of cards I would like to see added in the next historic anthology. Most historic anthologies have one or two kind of flashy cards who, granted, have historically varying degrees of influence on the format. For example, in Historic Anthology 4, it was Death Shadow, and while Death Shadow is a good card, it just doesn't see a whole lot of play. But it's not a bad card, and it's not overpowered in this format. And thinking about that made me think of our card on screen here on the Gatherer actual site here is Ghoultree. It's a card I actually happen to own in real life, somewhere in a box in the other room, in one of my teaching decks that I use to teach people how to play Magic. And this is my sort of submission, if anybody in the powers that be happen to see this, as well as just anybody in the community, for what I think the next cool, flashy rare should be that wouldn't be too insanely overpowered, kind of akin to, again, a Death Shadow. Ghoultree is just, well, we'll go over the card here. It's an 8 mana 10/10 zombie tree folk. I say 8 mana because, as you can see, Ghoultree costs 1 generic less to cast for each creature card in your graveyard. This means that it can technically be a 1 mana 10/10, but you have to go through various hoops. But even if you do happen to power it out very early, on the first, say, 2 or 3 turns, it's not terribly big. I mean, it's a big creature as a 10/10, but it doesn't have any evasion, doesn't generate card draw or any card advantage, requires a significant deck restriction, or deck building restriction, in order for it to work. Again, much like the example of a Death Shadow. So I would just like to put this as my little vote, my little vote in the hat, as it were, for what I think the next historic anthology card should be. And I'm actually going to kind of show a few cards in Arena that I think will, if it does, cards you could say run alongside it. And also kind of show that where synergies could lie, and where, if it does, hey, maybe you can work on making or getting those cards. But anywho, we'll cut over to those aforementioned cards right now. Ta-da! Welcome back. I wanted to show some cards that are, say, already in the format, at least as of today's video, that I think are like cards that could sort of work alongside this. These are in no particular order. I just happened to grab some cards that I think could work well with our Ghoultree example. And these, again, in no particular order, so we'll just kind of start. Stitcher Supplier is a pretty good graveyard enabler that, if you're running a graveyard deck, sees play, but if you're not, you don't run it. A very good card in one fairly narrow archetype, and even then, in Historic, the graveyard is already a hotly contested zone. So we don't really need to worry about graveyard strategies becoming too strong, or by proxy, Ghoultree. You can also, I think, running Village Rites with a Stitcher Supplier is always nice to get some card draw. Also have things like Corpse Churn to, say, get more things in your yard, and then also say if you mill over a Ghoultree, you can return the Ghoultree. Things like Mire Triton to also fill your yard, get you a little bit of life. A Death Touch creature also is a good wall. Rotting Register and Egon, God of Death. Rotting Register is pretty obvious, since once you play it, it itself is a pretty large body for a relatively low cost, much like the Ghoultree can be. Also can sort of fuel making a Ghoultree cheaper if over several turns you just, say, put more creatures into the yard. Egon is Egon himself is a little less of a synergy, though. It's one of those, if you're going to have cards in your yard, Egon isn't a terrible creature. It's more the Throne of Death that we like as a recurring source of milling stuff into our own yard. And hey, the ability to turn it into card draw with the Throne is nice. And Egon is an okay creature and nothing to scoff at. But it's really the Throne of Death that would work well with our Ghoul Tree buddy. Also cards like Fiend Artisan. One of those very cool cards from Ikoria. It's one of those mythic rares that I like to run from time to time, though I don't think it's terribly good, because again, it is as good as a graveyard can be in a format with a lot of graveyard hate. And this card sees, at least anecdotally, actually zero play. If I'm not running it in some weird goofy deck, which I might be over the next few weeks, it doesn't really see much play at all. And it's one of those, it's just basically, well, yes, you can cheat things into play. Much like the Ghoul Tree, you can cheat it into play earlier. It requires a whole lot of jumping through hoops, in particular deck restrictions, which I think is an okay thing to have. Also have cards like Witherbloom Command, where we can mill cards and then return land cards, which can help us not only fill our yard to make our thing cheaper, but ensure we don't miss land drops, kind of akin to what Glowspore Shamans and Skull Prophets do, but those are just on bodies. Also, the other particular four modes of the Witherbloom Command are just nice things to have in general. We could also, hell, if you want to run some old weird cards like Hatchery Spider, to where it's one of those, you're going to have enough cards in your graveyard for your undergrowth count to be relatively high, so you can make use of the undergrowth mechanic. A card that, a keyword, that's the word, that doesn't really see any play and hasn't since the days of the Crawl Harpooners. Are cards like Molder Hulk, that basically is another air quote Ghoul Tree. Again, this card sees actually zero play, unless me or somebody who likes to brew is particularly trying to make it work for a deck. If you wanted to see a already in the format sort of soft version of what the Ghoul Tree could be, Molder Hulk is that card. They are similar power levels, though granted they don't do exactly the same thing. But that is the closest comparison that I believe exists in the format. We also again have cards like Skull Prophet and Glowspore Shaman as ways to fill up your graveyard with the milling portion and either ensure you hit a land drop with cards like the Shaman, or actually be a mana dork like this with the Skull Prophet. Then you also have weird sort of support cards, like the Binding of the Titans, as a way to sort of fill up your yard, and granted with the Titans, you know, it also fills your opponent's yard. But hell, we can also, this also kind of shows that there's all kinds of little incidental graveyard hate in the format, so I don't think it's going to be, or would be a terribly overpowered card. Also things like Relentless Pursuit, it's one of those. It's basically card draw very narrowly. It can also fill up your yard. All of these things, cards like all the cards you see on screen, I think are cool cards that could go in some sort of Ghoul Tree deck. But of course, this all requires this to actually happen. But I just wanted to make a fun little thought experiment video on a card that I would like to see put into the next Historic Anthology. What do you think should be put into the next Historic Anthology? Why don't you leave a comment down below? And while you're there, leave a like on the video if you like it, and sub if you like me. With that out of the way, thank you all for watching. See you in the next video. Bye-bye!